Yep, we're getting people from
Great.
all over the state. I want to welcome everybody. And this is the second in our winter installment of Wilderness Wednesdays. These are co-presented through the University of Illinois Extension in Kankakee, along with the Kankakee Valley Forest Preserve District. And we have a fall, or like, I guess, a winter now, the January. Last week we had one today, and then about native and honeybees, and then next week will be the same time, and that is wetlands in the cinema, and that's going to be talking about how what we watch on TV and in movies affect how we feel about the wetlands, and I'm kind of excited about that. I think that's going to be something kind of different. And then we take kind of a break. And then in August, we do the Wilderness Wednesdays again, and we have 3 or 4 in a series. And that is something we can do in the evening, same time, that's 6 o'clock. And that way, when it's so hot, it's good to come in, take a little break, have dinner, and the Wilderness Wednesdays, you can just do it right in your jammies or whatever you want to do, whatever, with your hot tea, and learn a few new topics, hopefully. So tonight, I want to welcome everybody, and Shirlasmi, I've been practicing it, but I don't think I said it right. Shri Laskmi, Shmi.
Yeah, you're close. Sri Lakshmi.
I was practicing. I sounded better when I was doing it in the shower, but
It's the
tonight's
pressure.
Sharish, is that how you, Sharesh?
Suresh.
Suresh is the new horticulture educator for Unit 21, based out of Effingham, and we were just talking about all the snow they've gotten. They completed their Masters of Science in Entomology in May 2024, and Dr. Adam Dolzals, I might have
You're just having a time.
yes, lab at UIUC, where they studied honeybee foraging and mixed agriculture and urban ecosystems. Sherlaskmi's bee research career began in 2020 or 2015, where they originally hired to identify plants in Dr. Reed Johnson's lab at the Ohio State University. And I did okay with that name. Throughout their career, they have lived and taught in Japan, managed a bee lab, worked as a curator assistant in the herbarium, been a TA for multiple UIUC courses, volunteered with the UIUC Gender and Sexual Resource Center, and worked on more honeybee research topics than they can count. So and I wanted to also say that a lot of the pictures that'll be used tonight are their own. So besides doing all that, apparently photography is another thing that is a passion. So with that, why don't you take it away and tell us all about native and honeybees?
All right, thank you for the introduction, Holly. So as Holly introduced me, again, I'm Sri Lakshmi Suresh. I use they, them pronouns. I am the brand new horticulture educator for Effingham County, Effingham, Fayette, Jasper, and Clay counties, which is a mouthful every time. And I'm here to talk a bit about the differences between native and honeybees. So I kind of mentioned in that introduction, or at least Holly did, that I've been a professional beekeeper before. I've managed a bee lab, but I also have expertise in native bees. And I feel very strongly that they both have a role in our environment. Having been a beekeeper and also having a passion about our native bees. And one quick note throughout the presentation, when I talk about native bees, I'm referring to North America. So one phrase that probably everyone here has heard of is save the bees. And most have heard this phrase, but often there's a lack of information or context in the intent of the phrase. And in recent years, this has become a kind of divisive issue or phrase because there is kind of a difference between conservation and agriculture. And I would say the source of the problem between the divisiveness and kind of the misinformation is kind of a lack of clarity and information we don't do necessarily a great job of explaining the differences between honeybees and native bees. So hopefully, everyone here and everyone who'll be listening to a recording will get a bit out of this presentation. And my take is that, like many things in nature, balance is key. So before we talk about bees themselves, I want to go ahead and define what pollination is, because we talk about it often, but what is it really? So pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the male anthers of a flower to the female stigma. So on the right, I have a diagram of a flower that has both male and female parts. You can see on the right side, there's the andrecium, which is referring to all of the stamens together. And at the top of the stamen, there are the anthers where the pollen is produced. And on the left, there is the ovary diagram, the gynecium, which is all of the carpels. That's the female portion of the plant. Plants generally want to have sexual reproduction rather than asexual reproduction. They're trying to get that pollen from the anther to the stigma. Sexual reproduction for plants introduces a lot of genetic variation, helps with DNA repair, and is also good for evolution long term. And plants also try to attract help from pollinators having colors. They have specific scents. They can also have nectar that they produce to attract these pollinators, because last time I checked, plants don't really walk around. They don't move around a lot, so they need a little help for that. So talking about what pollination is, I want to also talk about what pollination isn't. So pollination has nothing to do with anything that happens after the flower is gone. It has nothing to do with the fruit or the seeds. Pollination is not solely drinking nectar. For instance, I have a little photo of me feeding a little bumblebee that stumbled close to one of my beehives. And that is not pollination, because there's nothing to do with the pollen. Eating fruit, for instance, we always think about animals eating fruit and then they poop, and then there's more plants that sprout because of the seeds in the poop, but that is also not pollination. It's crucial for our ecosystem, but it's not dealing with that pollen. Seed dispersal, as I just mentioned, not pollination, and anything damaging to the plant. So that beautiful, cute little chipmunk that I saw nibbling away at some of the plants, like, unless that snout is covered in pollen, it's not pollination. Only pollen and the stigma, the female part of the plant, is involved. So talking about pollinators. So pollinators then are organisms that facilitate the transfer of pollen grains from the male anthers of a plant to the female stigma. Some common pollinators that you might see around are bees, beetles, flies, butterflies, bats, birds, and in some places lizards. But notice that my definition is definitively pretty broad, and I did that on purpose because, by my definition, us humans doing hand pollination would count if we are trying to facilitate, again, that pollen transfer from the anther to the stigma. Just a fun aside, in November 2024, there was research that came out that the Ethiopian wolf may be a pollinator, which if they continue to study that and confirm that, that would be very cool, because that would be our first predator pollinator that we know of. A sort of sad aside to that aside is that the Ethiopian wolf is actually the most endangered carnivore on the African continent. There are only 500 left in the world. But of the things we're learning about them, that's really cool. Moving back to pollinators, so many organisms visit plants. It's not just bees. You'll see flies, you'll see wasps, you'll see butterflies. So when you're a flower, we're going to personify this flower. We are hoping that a pollinator comes along. We're hoping that this pollinator rubs against our stamen to get some of that pollen. We hope that pollinator flies to a different flower of the same species, and we hope that pollinator rubs against the stigma. I hope also that you kind of got the sense that there's a decent amount of chance involved here. And this is true. There are things that can increase the chance of successful pollination, floral anatomy, pollinator anatomy, and behavior. But I'm talking about this because I want to mention that only a few pollinators are efficient pollinators. And of the pollinators that we know, bees are amongst the most efficient pollinators. Bees, by the way, are in the order Hymenoptera, clade Anthophila, which means that they are flower lovers in Latin. And a minor aside again is you will see in my presentation that I always have honey space bee. It's not one word. I have it described as two because etymologically, we define something that is a type of, if it's a type of insect, there's always the space. So for instance, a butterfly is not a type of fly, so it's one word. A dragonfly is not a type of fly, so it's one word. But a housefly is a type of fly, so we have house space fly. So same with honeybee, I always put the space in there. Just another fun fact. And so talking about why bees are efficient pollinators, it's all in the hair. Bees have just, they always have good hair days like every day. Um, and I have this asterisk here because in biology and nature, there's always exceptions. There's always never going to be a clear cut everything statement because that's just how nature is. Bees' hair is often very feathery. I have that diagram on the right. That's a drawing. Their hair can be feathery, which helps grab onto the pollen. Some bees, many bees, co-evolved with flowers for precise pollination strategies. And I'm sure that if anyone here has long-haired pets or if you have long hair yourself, you can imagine if you have more hair and if you have very thick hair, there's going to be more stuff that sticks to the more hair you have. And it's a similar sort of thing. Wasps and flies that aren't as hairy are just not going to collect as much pollen because there's not much there. Then addition, having that feathery kind of hair also helps the pollen stick on. And then there's specific pollen collecting hairs where bees kind of pack in pollen. And so talking about the evolution of bees, bees are essentially vegetarian wasps. They evolved from wasps about 125 million years ago, as far as we can tell from the fossil record. And this date is about when flowering plants also first started to evolve because we had, of course, non-flowering plants, think of conifers, ferns, etc. Flowering plants, angiosperms, started to take off around this time, and bees saw the great opportunity in their vegetarian food, pollen and nectar, and they just took off with it. Bees really get all of their nutrients from flowers. And fun fact, there are over 20,000 species of bees globally. In Illinois alone, there's 500 different species of bees. And for my close friend Tess, shout out to her, there are about 450 bee species in Ohio. So there's many more than you would think. And so when we think of bees, there are a lot of reasons as to why they're important. And a quick note, a lot of my slides from here on out, I'm kind of having this compare contrast honeybees and native bees. So I will note again that honeybees Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, is just one species of bee that I'm then comparing with 499 other species of bee in Illinois. So please note that I'm talking about, this one species as compared to many, many other bees. And you'll kind of hear throughout this presentation, honeybees or bumblebees, which is another bee that a lot of people know and are familiar with, they make up together less than 1% of all bee species around the world. And you'll also learn throughout this presentation, honeybees are often the exception to bee species in terms of their behavior and anatomy. So without further ado, jumping into their importance. They're both really valuable for our environment, and often in overlapping ways. Honeybees are non-native to North America. They're introduced from Europe. They were brought over by European colonizers to help pollinate some of the crops and plants that they brought over from their home countries. So honeybees, European honeybees, have only been in North America for about 400 years. Honeybees are domestic livestock. And yes, livestock, same as cattle, goats, any other things you would see on a farm. In domestication here, I'm referring specifically to a distinctive co-evolutionary mutualistic relationship between the domesticator, humans, and the domesticated animal. And I'm referring to it differently from resource management and agriculture. It's an evolutionary process to have a domesticated animal, and honeybees are domesticated. Beekeepers very significantly manipulate hives, and shout out to your local beekeeper association if you want to hear about ways that beekeepers manipulate hives and learn more. Honeybees are really crucial to our food systems and our agriculture. A lot of the food that we eat here in North America, in America specifically, we need help from honeybees to pollinate. There are crops and other foods we eat, like for almonds, for instance. Well over 90% of the almonds we have here in California are going to be pollinated by the honeybee solely. So they are very important to us here. But when we're talking about native bees now are wild animals. There are some exceptions to where there are people who will keep some of these native bees because they are extremely efficient pollinators. And native bees are also very crucial to our food webs, our ecosystems, food systems, and agriculture. So you'll note that I kind of added the food webs and ecosystems, contrasting with honeybees, because these are our bees that have been on the continent for millions of years and have co-evolved with what we have here. And they're still crucial to our food systems because you'll find native bees pollinating foods like pumpkin, watermelon, tomatoes, apples, blueberries, cherries, that would not be well pollinated without our native bees. And I have a photo that I took in that bottom right. That's actually a sweat bee on a wild raspberry flower, for instance. And so here I'm going to start talking about some of the differences. And note that I only have like another 30 minutes with all of you, so I'm not going to be able to get through everything, but I'll talk through some of the overarching differences to kind of get at the differences between honeybees and native bees, thinking about conservation and agriculture. So thinking about the honeybee life cycle, queen honeybees can live up to 3 to 5 years. Unfortunately, nowadays they're really only living 1 to 2 for a variety of factors. When we hear about issues with our honeybees, queen issues can be one of those issues, and it is a major one. It's definitely a much shorter life cycle. I know that I've seen queen bees or talked to beekeepers that have had trouble keeping their queens alive for a full year, which is not great. Worker bees that are the ones that you'll see flying around for the most part, they can live 1 to 14 months, and this lifespan is really determined by the season. The workers that are born in the winter or just ahead of the winter are going to live longer than spring or fall, and those spring or fall bees are going to live longer than bees in the summer. This is predominantly because those bees that are flying around in the summer, spring and fall, etc., they're doing a lot more work, expending a lot more energy. Those winter bees are there just to make sure that the hive doesn't freeze over, the queen stays alive. etc. And overall, the workers take about 21 days from egg to adult. And I also want to take a moment to point out that bees in general have a haplodiploid sex determination, which means the females are born from a fertilized egg. They have two sets of chromosomes, while the males are unfertilized eggs. They only have one chromosome. So male bees don't have fathers, but they have grandfathers, which is always like a funny thing to wrap your mind around. And another fun fact, so female bees can sting because they have an ovipositor. The stinger is a modified ovipositor, which then means male bees of any species cannot physically sting because there's no ovipositor. The queen and worker bees are female and the drones are male. So getting into native bees, again, comparing one species to 499 other species very considerably. But a common strategy is to follow the seasons. Many native bees have a lifespan, a total lifespan of about 1 year. And one thing to note is that they're really only an adult for a few weeks or months. So for example, I have a wool carder bee and I have a cute little photo in the bottom right-hand corner of that little friend. So for instance, females will lay their eggs in the fall. Females will die off and the larva will hatch in that nest. Most of the time, most of that 1 year life cycle is actually going to be spent in the last larval stage as a pre-pupa. And they will then pupate and emerge as an adult in the spring and start the process all over again. So a lot of the life cycle of these native bees, you actually will not see. When we think of nests, European honeybee colonies are absolutely massive. They're insane. Even compared to other honeybee species, such as the Asian honeybee or the giant honeybee, which is also in Southeastern Asia, actually. Their colonies are not going to get nearly as big. Bumblebees that also live eusocially, not going to get much larger than maybe 200, 300 individuals. So we really kind of see here how honeybees are the exception almost immediately. And honeybees try to seek out hollow trees. That's where they kind of evolve to live in. And I'll talk about, of course, what we see for our domesticated honeybees we'll see at farms. But talking about native bees, these guys are mostly solitary. The vast majority of bees live in nests alone. Many are ground nesters, and there can also be twig and stem nesters as well as cavity nesters. So I have in the bottom right, I have, let's see, in the very bottom right, I have a Colites plasterer bee who lives in the ground. I have a two-spotted bumblebee queen that I found emerging from her ground hibernacula. And then I also had the Megachile, the leafcutter bee, who is in actually a bee hotel that I'll talk about later. And a cross section of one of those kind of nests you can see here. It's kind of like a little conga line where the males actually are at the bottom. They emerge first. The females are towards the back because they take a little longer to develop. And so talking about the habitat, again, honeybees are usually on farms because they're brought over by humans. They're not naturally in North America. We place hives in specific parts of the landscape for our own purposes. That said, there are some feral honeybee colonies. I'm sure folks have seen like the wild and crazy kind of bees in the attic or in a wall or in an old car. And it always amuses me to think of the fact that the honeybee, even if they're in that house or an old car, it's essentially a weird hollow tree to them. But that's what they're looking for, an enclosed safe space to have their hive. native bees, again, some species are actually brought by humans, are kept commercially. For instance, the osmia, the orchard bee, is sometimes kept for apple pollination. The alfalfa leafcutter, which is actually another introduced species, is used for pollination, and the eastern bumblebee is used for tomato pollination. So there are some exceptions to commercial rearing, but in general, again, they vary wildly. But certain bees tend to have favorites of where they live. Generally, bees are going to want to live in open areas like prairies where they have a lot of options for their nesting habitat. Bees are generally not often found in forests. I know we kind of think of this picturesque forest scene, but bees are generally not there, with the exception of these Hylaeus mast bees, which I'll try to point out in some other slides. Those guys tend to like woody areas. So the topic of honey. Honeybees make honey, which should hopefully not come as a shock to anyone here. What's really cool is they actually use their little wings to evaporate the water out of it. And that's a very cool process that you should absolutely look into. But this honey is used to feed the colony throughout the winter because honeybee colonies can live for many years or be sustained for many years. They might replace the queen, but that colony is still in that same place for a long time. And you might have heard that honey does not expire, and that's because it has a water content that is quite low. About 15 to 18% water, no more than that. And it also has an extremely high sugar content. It's a very low acidity. And there are also enzymes such as hydrogen peroxide in it that make it antimicrobial. Um, so native bees don't make any honey. And again, nature always has an exception. The exception here are there are stingless bees, Melipona bees, in South America, native to that area, that produce a honey. There are some actually in Central America too, now that I think about it, but we certainly don't have any stingless bees that produce enough honey to really rear in America. I will note that bumblebees make a honey-like substance, but their colonies only live 1 year, so it's much more like a nectar and it will spoil. Adults are the ones mostly consuming the honey in colonies. So when we talk about their food, honeybees are kind of like a generalist to the extreme. They're all about convenience. It's kind of like if they have the choice between going to Costco or Save-A-Lot and Kroger, they're always going to Costco all the time because they can just get everything all at once. Many of the honeybees actually go to what we consider weeds here because a lot of the weeds that we have are actually introduced from Europe. They're going to the foods that are essentially familiar to them. So I have a little chart that I pulled from my thesis actually, where I tracked some honeybee hives for about 2 years and ID'd the pollen that they're collecting. And you can see that pretty much half of the pollen that I found in those hives was from an introduced to North America species, and a full third had some sort of legal control status in Illinois as being an invasive or even a noxious weed. So honeybees will just kind of go wherever they can find food. This can even mean soybean or clover because there's just a whole lot of it everywhere. Whereas if we think about native bees, there are some generalists, but there are more specialists. But when we talk about specialists, the adults might still go to various nectar sources. We're really talking about the larvae that are obligates, that will need one specific species or species of plants to be able to survive and grow into the adult. The adults and larvae will often eat different things. So for a specific example, I think of Xenoglossa pruinosa, the squash bee, or also called the pumpkin bee. You might find the adults drinking nectar from different flowers, but they will always provision the nests with pollen from cucurbit flowers. So those are going to be pumpkins, cucumbers, other squashes. The larvae cannot survive on anything else. So talking about the ecology, um, honeybees have predators, so they are contributing to our native environment there. And in order of their predator pressure are insects, mammals, and birds. So insects are by far and large the biggest predator of honeybees. And I have a photo of when I was actually extracting some honey from one of my hives. This yellow jacket came in and was trying to like grab one of my honeybees that had wandered in through the window. And I just, without thinking, I just grabbed it out of air because I was so mad that this wasp was trying to eat one of my bees. Anyways, when I realized that what I had done, I grabbed a photo before I chucked that guy outside. But honeybees, thinking about those insect predators, but they also have a lot of mammalian predators. They can sting only once and they die due to evisceration. Their organs actually will come out, some of them, when they sting, because there is a muscle that will continue pumping venom after the sting has been released. And a lot of social insects are very defensive of their hives because they have extremely delicious babies. Like if you imagine you're like a skunk or a bear or some other mammal, there's just like this little candy, there's like this gummy ball machine of like fat, wriggly gummy bears full of fat and protein en masse, and it's just sitting there. They can't do anything. They just kind of wiggle at you. And if you think of how nice it would be to be walking in the forest and you just come across this free, delicious, nutritious food, that's essentially what social insects, honeybees, bumblebees, social wasps are trying to protect. Their babies, everyone wants to eat them, and they have absolutely no protection other than the adults. So that's why they get defensive of their hives. And those honeybees are dying after they sting because of their anti-mammalian barb. Um, and again, honeybees are valuable for our agricultural purposes, and they also do pollinate wildflowers to a degree. Whereas our native bees, their predators are mostly, we're thinking about insects and birds because, again, thinking about that solitary lifestyle, they're less concentrated. They're going to face a lot of pressures from other insects and kind of these one-off situations. They can generally sting many times, but their venom is generally, in my personal experience, less potent than a honeybee's. And native bees, again, are valuable to our natural environment, agriculture, and our natural wildflowers. Native flowers need our native pollinators. And same with our native predators. Insects really feed our food webs. So kind of thinking about some of the issues we might see. It's become a conversational topic that people kind of pit native bees and honeybees against each other. So thinking about some of the things that can affect both of these types of bees. So honeybee scientists commonly refer to the 4 Ps that really affect honeybees and lead to their declines that we're seeing. And these 4 Ps generally overlap with native bee issues as well. And so those 4 Ps are poor forage, pesticides, pests, and pathogens. So talking about poor forage first, that just means there's just not much food. And the flowers that are available are nutritionally poor. So I have a photo at right, that is Champaign County, a photo I took while I was flying out of the Champaign airport. And you can see there's a whole lot of farms, a whole lot of large farms that are really important to our food and economy, but that's not prairie or forest. So as a reference point, in 1820, there were 22 million acres of prairie and 14 million acres of forest in the state of Illinois. We are nowhere near that anymore. And you can see by that photo, we are not seeing 22 million acres of prairie or 14 million acres of forest. And so the flowers that bees are finding are often nutritionally poor. They're going to be soybean, or they're going to be those weeds that those introduced plants. The native plants are really sparse. And noting that these available plants, again, are not necessarily very nutritious. They might lack some of the amino acids or protein or lipid content that some of the bees really need. And so moving on to next P, pesticides. There are a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. But we do know some things definitely kill bees. I have a little photo of an insecticide that I saw had an active ingredient of imidacloprid, which is a neonicotinoid insecticide, which is known to kill bees. But in terms of research we're still trying to figure out how some pesticides affect bee behavior, how it affects larvae, how it affects pupa. There's just a lot we don't know because there's many more pesticides than bee researchers out there to be able to study these specific effects. But a good thing we have is that we do have recommendations now not to spray when adult bees are flying, which is work that my undergraduate PI, Dr. Bree Johnson at The Ohio State University, helped do research on. When we think about native bees and pesticides, in general, pesticides that kill honeybees also tend to kill native bees. Many of our native bees are in the bee family Apidae, and honeybees are also in the family Apidae. So it kind of tends to follow, makes sense that pesticides that would kill one species within this family would kill other members of that same family. But again, there's a lot of unknowns. There's just a lot of research that needs to be done. When we think of pathogens and pests, honeybees have a lot of diseases that can arise from fungi, bacteria, from viruses. Beekeeping is centuries old, so there's generally a lot more awareness of the ailments that they might face. For example, of some of these diseases, that might be chalk brood, deformed wing virus, nosema, and many, many more. It's really crucial for beekeepers to be responsible and regularly treat and monitor their bees for signs of diseases, because we all know from the COVID-19 pandemic that a lot of people in a small place and a lot of people moving all over the place will spread disease. And that is very much the case if beekeepers are not monitoring their hives and they're not treating their hives for diseases and for pests. Many of these things can spread. And pests too can be predators. I have a photo of a mouse that I pulled out of one of my colonies. It was a very cute baby mouse, but I had to definitely evict that little critter from eating some of my honey and pollen. And then I have a photo of small hive beetle larvae on an observation hive. Observation hives that I was specifically using for research are weird and strange, and so that's why they're in a regular beehive. You would pretty much never see that photo that I took. That is a photo of something going very clearly wrong, but I know what happened because I had to do very weird things to get scientific data, and that is a trade-off doing research sometimes. Think about native bees and pathogens and pests. We just don't know a lot. Biology and life history is understudied. And that means that we don't have a baseline and we don't have a normal. We don't have a lot of literature on those issues. And so we have to know what's normal first to really understand what's abnormal. And whoops, got a little too fast there. We assume that pathogen transfer is bad, We can see sometimes that there is a transfer of pathogens, that honeybees will visit the same flowers that our native bees will also visit. And there's research trying to come out exploring how they might affect each other now. But a conservative estimate is that pathogen transfer is bad. It's often just easier to prevent disease than treat it after the fact. Um, so returning to the phrase save the bees, there's clearly a lot of different facets to it and a lot of nuance when we're thinking about um, conservation and agriculture. When we hear save the bees, if you had to pick out one issue, in my opinion, I would say lack of food. So thinking again about the fact that we do not have 22 million acres of prairie or 14 million acres of forest, there is just way less food for bees. And the food that they do have, again, is not great for them. So if we're thinking about these pests and pathogens and pesticides and these other things they're facing, and they don't have good food, it's kind of like being sick and only having potato chips. If you're sick and recovering from a cold, you're probably not going to want to eat a lot of junk food. You're really going to need good, healthy, nutritious food to be able to recover from being ill. Everything interacts in an ecosystem. All of those peas are bad and they interact. Um, and so talking a bit about bee hotels, which is a really cool thing that I've seen around, but I will caution that they hurt more than help without stringent maintenance and sanitation. So twigs, for instance, need to be replaced annually, or you essentially kind of make a petri dish of disease. There's a lot of disease transmission research that is ongoing now at the University of Illinois. And these bee hotels also kind of concentrate these solitary bees in a very small area, which if you are a bird or a wasp, or a mammal trying to get your dinner, that's a great idea to put all of these bees in just one area because now you have a one-stop dinner shop. So there's a lot of things that can happen with the bee hotels that require this maintenance, but I will say they can be great educational tools. The photos I have here on the right are from Penn State. They have pollinator research garden there, and this is a bee hotel that is very stringently, very regularly maintained. Twigs are replaced. The logs and whatnot are sanitized annually in a bleach solution, etc. And so it's great to kind of show how these bees live. So that's a lot of what doesn't really help. What can you actually do? So back to my opinion of bees just not having food, I would say plant native flowers is a very easy thing to do. Any flowers are valuable if you can't plant native flowers or don't have access to native flowers, because they need that nutritious food to be able to survive and fight off some of these issues they're facing. And I would honestly say that planting native flowers or planting any flowers is really better than becoming a beekeeper or putting up a bee hotel, because you're really not having to worry about all the responsibility of preventing disease transfer, all of this maintenance, etc. And even container and balcony gardens can support bees. I have a photo here of when I was the bee lab manager at Ohio State. I saw, I had these native plants that were just on my balcony, and it's not pictured right there, but I actually had a plant stand that's out of the frame. And while those plants were flowering later in the year, even though it wasn't much, I actually had leafcutter bees that found my plant stand next to these pots, and they nested in the holes within my plant stand because they were attracted to the native plants I just had in containers on my balcony. So with all of this, I will add a disclaimer that we are always learning. There's always new information coming along. There's likely updates to the suggestions that I gave here today and to some of the research I shared, that's the best thing about science, in my opinion. We're always improving, learning, and growing. And I want to leave you here with thinking about what you can do. Think about what you perhaps knew or thought you knew about bees before this presentation and what you might have learned after this. And I encourage you to share that information. Seek out information and share it with others. Follow your curiosity and help other people also be curious. And if I had to say one thing to continue doing, is continue caring. Care about the environment, care about your curiosity in yourself, and engage with these sorts of seminars and trying to figure out what you're passionate about and share that. So with that, I think I'm perfectly on my 45-minute time. So thank you, and I would love to take questions. Let's see if there is.
We have a few questions. Okay, oh, there's somebody that had to leave. Let's see. Oh, they were talking about a wolf being a pollinator. It was fascinating. Yeah, that was kind of interesting.
I see one question about how about not using herbicides on lawns? So that is another thing to where we're kind of still, we don't know a lot about it. I will say lawns generally just don't have flowers, and the bees eat the flower parts, the pollen and the nectar, and lawns in general don't have their food either. So probably again, my pro tip, as it were, is to plant some flowers if you want to help bees out. In terms of herbicides that are on the lawn, there's just so many out there that we just don't know about. Conservatively, we can assume that if you're killing plants and then you're killing flowers, that's probably not great for bees. But there's so many different factors that go into that it's hard to give a one answer that fulfills everything.
And don't you have to be careful about the plants you get like at Lowe's or Menards or whatever? Don't they grow them with pesticides or herbicides and stuff in them? Just,
Yes, sometimes
there's a
there
lot of
are
that.
garden centers that will
Garden
grow
centers, right.
yes, with insecticides that are not necessarily bee friendly, or they might be certified as bee friendly, but there's ongoing research about their negative effects. And this is where I will do my plug of support your local businesses. I've seen a lot more local garden centers that will have native plants that they're selling. And a lot of times these places may have native plants that are grown without insecticides or with fewer insecticides. Also, if you have a master gardener program in your area, oftentimes master gardeners will have native plant sales. So
We do.
check out your local extension office.
That's a good one.
Thank you. Christine has a question about good website or resource to learn about native Illinois bees. So I actually have a fantastic resource, and let's see if I don't awkwardly change the screen too much. IllinoisPollinators.org. Can you still see my screen?
Yep, I
Okay,
see it.
so this
Yes,
is a
we can.
website from Illinois Extension about pollinators, and we have a couple of different tabs. Importance of pollinators, plants that they use, habitat design, which is really cool. We have some samples of garden plots that you might want to put in, as well as community science. And this is a website that I did also contribute to a little bit, especially on the WASP page. I think a lot of these descriptions I helped input. So definitely recommend that. And then I came prepared. Best field guide for if you're out in the wild looking for bees, I would use the Common Bees of Eastern North America guide. There's a Western pair to this guidebook if you're watching from the West. This is the best guidebook for native bees that we have, and you can see it has kind of habitat description, the location. It has very good photos that help you decide the species of bee. And then also, this is probably my #1 favorite book on bees. The Bees in Your Backyard by Joe Wilson and Olivia Messenger Carroll. This is a great book because I think it does a fantastic job of not only kind of introducing bees in a beginner-friendly way, but also as a professional researcher, sometimes I'll just grab this book for a quick reference. It does a great job of explaining concepts in a way that makes sense. And it's also, I am a huge nerd and I actually use this as a coffee table book. I'll just like keep this out for people to flip through when they visit me because there's a lot of really nice photos. Let's see, Sarah.
What was that called
Oh.
again? I'm sorry. Can you maybe somebody write
This-
that down in the chat or something? What was it called?
This
I'll do
is
that.
The Bees in Your Backyard
Okay.
by Joe Wilson and Olivia Messenger Carroll.
Thank
Same
you.
authors for, what's this called? Common Bees of Eastern North America. Okay, there, and hopefully I don't have too many typos.
No, you're
Um,
fine. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sarah asked, is there any research on how bees do with nativars? So for folks that don't know, nativars are what we kind of call native plants that are cultivated to be a little more showy. I'm gonna see if I can pull up maybe a random plant here. Great, bee balm. So I have an example of bee balm up here. And so a nativar is a cultivated flower. So instead of cultivar, it being a native plant, we call it a nativar. The problem with a lot of cultivars or cultivated flowers is that a lot of the anthers and the nectaries, the places where bees get the pollen and the nectar to feed themselves, are just not accessible. Nativars, sometimes it really varies with the nativar. Similarly, are kind of bred in a way that they look really showy and pretty for us humans, but it can be hard for our pollinating insects to really be able to actually get to the pollen and the nectar in the nativars. This really kind of varies, and the research on that is kind of ongoing to be determined. So I don't have any studies that I can immediately point you to off the top of my head, but that is something that I know research colleagues have talked about and have identified as something that needs to be studied. In general, if you have access to native plants, again, check your local extension office for your Master Naturalist and Master Gardeners annual plant sale. But beyond that, also your local garden centers for your native plants, and check that perhaps that they aren't nativars, because the plants in their natural state are pretty much always going to be good to go because that's what our native pollinators evolved with. Drink some water. I've been doing a lot of talking.
I was just going through to make sure that we have covered all the questions. Yeah, I think we have. I think we've gotten all the questions. The one question I have is what got you interested in this topic?
In which topic specifically?
Well, in the native Illinois bees.
I just thought they were really cool. Like, I mean, I think I also went through the journey of knowing that honeybees were very different from our native bees and that we had so many native bees. And it's, I think one of the best thing about insects is that they're wild animals that pretty much anyone can see and interact with much more um, safely and ethically than you can with some of these wild mammals. Like, for instance, like if you saw a fox in the wood and tried to pet it, that would not be great. Probably not for you and probably not for the fox either. But a lot of wild insects, you can kind of like chill out with them and interact with them. So, kind of learning about native bees, it was just kind of like, wow, these are all these wild animals that I can actually see and interact with and are helping me. And most of us are just living our lives so fast that we don't notice them. So, I don't know. I just thought they were really cool. And also, a lot of them are really pretty and very cute. Um, I see Christine Roberts asked, do you have a favorite bee? Yes. Well, my favorite family of bee are the megachilids or the leafcutter bees. I just think they're really cute. And they are special because while many bees will actually collect pollen and have pollen collecting hairs on their legs, megachilid bees or leafcutter bees will actually have their leaf collecting hairs on the underside of their abdomen. So in short, they have very, very fuzzy butts. They're just like the fuzziest butt bees ever. Um, and also they will cut little circles out of leaves and line their nests with these leaves. And so they also sleep in leaf blankets. And what more could you want than fuzzy butts and leaf blankets, really? Um, Very specifically, I think one of the coolest bees that I've ever seen is a Thyreus bee. We don't have it in North America, but the decorated cloak and dagger bee is the coolest bee name that I think I've ever heard. And also, it's this electric blue striped bee. Um, and I think I saw one very briefly while I was in Japan last year, on a trip to speak with Japanese beekeepers. So that was really cool. Sarah did mention that local garden centers will usually sell nativars and call them natives, so be careful if you are buying them from a store. Yes, and when in doubt, feel free to talk to us at Extension, your horticulture educators, me and other folks across the state, or for Tess, who's in Ohio, check out your Ohio State horticulture educators. We are here to help you and be a resource to the public. We want to help you. We want to have you have the best knowledge possible. And so we'll help you figure out where you can get natives if you're unsure of your local garden centers having natives that are good for our native pollinators.